In this last section of lecture, I'm going to talk more about health messaging, or essentially how a lot of these different theories that we've talked about are harnessed to create different messages that go out to the public and to try to get them to change their health behaviors. You've been exposed to many in your life. You might remember one that was around U of T when you could still be on campus last year. This is not the exact one, I couldn't find it, but a very similar one. There was lots of pictures, at least in the men's room around U of T, of bananas that were looking kind of nasty, telling you to go get that checked, right? This is just one example of many kinds of public health campaigns that we get exposed to. Many people growing up were part of DARE campaigns in their school to get people not to do drugs. There's all different kinds of public health campaigns that can be as simple as posters hung up in public spaces to more involved programs that are done in schools and other workplace contexts. So we're just going to talk a little bit about some of the psychology that underlies these and why some are effective and why many are less effective, despite what we know about research. So we're seeing even more public health messages now. Obviously, we're in a public health crisis with COVID-19, right? And so some can be very information-focused, right? This one is really focused on what the different symptoms are, giving more information about that. And here's another one that's also giving information, but it's telling you more about what social distancing is. But what you can see what these have in common is they're trying to make this clear, direct, to the point. They're using a lot of visual imagery and trying to get this information out to the public. And this, again, is based on those models we talked about, right, with the health beliefs model and the theory of planned behavior, right? If you know what you need to do and you know about the issue and how severe it is and what the symptoms are, then you might be more likely to change your behavior is the hope here, that by getting this information out, we might get people to engage more in physical distancing and preventing the spread of COVID. So, thinking about educational appeals, like those ones that I just showed that are trying to give you specific information to get you to change your behavior, there's some characteristics that can make these more or less effective. And again, this is something I cover in much more depth in an attitudes class when we talk about persuasion, but here we're really focusing on it in a health context, and so drawing on some of those ideas, but applying them specifically to health behavior change. So the assumption of an educational appeal is that you give somebody information, and that's going to change their attitude, right? And so first of all, you can already see that this assumption doesn't always work. Often people defend against information. They have biases in their information processing such that they're less likely to adopt information that conflicts with their current view, and more likely to listen to information that confirms their current view. So information hopefully leads to attitude change to the extent that that information is correct and updates your attitude on that topic. But it doesn't always. And then the second piece of this assumption is that attitude change is then going to lead to behavior change, right? And this is a very similar assumption to what we saw in the theory of planned behavior, that our attitudes and intentions are going to impact our behavior. And this is often true. Certainly having a positive attitude towards something versus a negative attitude is going to make you more likely to do it, but it doesn't ensure that behavior change, right? We used the example before. I have generally a positive attitude towards exercise. I think it's important. I think it's valuable. I have lots of intentions to do it, but that doesn't tend to end up happening. Like, there's a breakdown between that intention and that behavior. And educational appeals suffer from this same issue as well. People might have that information. They might even change their attitude and say, yeah, COVID's really severe, I need to be careful, but for many reasons that may not lead to behavior change. Maybe there's other benefits to being around others that are outweighing that for them. Maybe there's factors in their life that's preventing them from being able to social distance, like needing to work at certain types of jobs where that's just not possible. And so there's lots of things that could account for that breakdown. And so while educational appeals are not ineffective, right? They can be effective. Certainly we do need this information. That's an important basis, but they don't solve public health problems. Wouldn't that be nice? They tend to be more effective if it's vivid communication, and by vivid I mean that it's compelling, right? We see a lot of graphic design in these. If it's a audio or video ad, right, you're going to have very engaging content to it. There's lots of different formats educational appeals can be made in, but there's whatever the format is, you want it to be engaging and vivid. And this is something that you'll be thinking about when you do your health communication assignment, right? You'll be taking what you learned in your research and essentially creating an educational persuasive appeal, right? You're telling your audience about what you learned, and hopefully getting them to act in some way based on that, or at least to consider that information, right? So you want to communicate that vividly in whatever format you choose. Expert communicators tend to be more persuasive on these educational facts, right? People want to hear from the experts generally. Strong arguments at the beginning and end are particularly effective, right? You don't want the strong stuff to get lost in the middle. You really want to start strong and end strong. Clear, short, direct messages are more effective, right? We all have shortening attention spans these days, and we have lots of other things that are competing for our attention, so having it be short, clear, and direct is going to be really important to an effective educational appeal. And the messages should state the conclusions explicitly. Really telling the person what they need to do with that information. Often people don't make those connections themselves. And so again, this is part of being short, clear, and direct. These tend to be the most effective of educational appeals. But also people need to find the source and the information credible, and this is something that can be an issue, right? So even if you have an expert communicator, people may have various reasons for not considering that person an expert or considering that credible. Like we're seeing more and more of this anti-science attitude, particularly in the US. I went to grad school out in California, and there's a big resurgence there of people being anti-vax, and it doesn't matter that professionals, expert doctors, and many of them, and all of them essentially, are saying vaccines are important. They're not finding that source credible. They don't have faith in the medical institution, so it doesn't matter that that person's an expert on that topic. So you do need to have an audience that finds that information and that source credible. And they also have to be motivated and have the cognitive resources to process that information, right? So this is, again, why you want to keep it short and direct. People don't usually have a lot of cognitive resources to process that information. So if you have a longer educational appeal, you want to make sure that the people you're targeting with that are at least in a position where they have the time and energy to process that. Fear appeals. This is another way that we might try to change people's health behaviors. I don't think I can show this within this slide, but this is a video that I remember very well from my childhood. This was a public health message that went out to all of us. I'll post the link also on our weekly page, but you can watch this, and it just shows celebrity who's our compelling communicator here, going around and really scaring the audience about the effect of drugs. She smashes a bunch of eggs, smashes things all around her kitchen in this ad, and so this is an example of a fear appeal. She's telling you all about all the horrible things that doing drugs is going to do to you, and really using a fear appeal to try to get people to change here. We see fear appeals all the time with anti-smoking ads, right? They frequently, this is one of the ones that was the least graphic, right? It's not hard to find really graphic images of all the terrible things that will happen to you if you smoke. They're all over the packets of cigarettes in the hope that this will get people to quit if they just know about these awful things. So again, this is one of the least graphic ones, but it's highlighting that you'll die if you do this, right? They're really appealing to threat and fear. So how effective are these? Or first, actually, when are they likely to be most and least effective? Well, there's a few different factors that are at play here. Right? So fear appeals can be effective, but only up to a certain point, up to a certain level of threat. I'll come back to that. But essentially, we see this curvilinear relationship between fear and threat and attitude change, such that a moderate amount of fear and threat can induce quite a bit of attitude change. But if you overwhelm the people with that, then our defensive processes start to kick in, and we deny and defend against that threat. And so it no longer has the same effect on attitude change, because we're not fully processing that information. We're just not taking it in. We say, I don't want to deal with that. Awful things will happen if I continue to smoke, but I do smoke. I'm not going to deal with that. I'm just going to stress and not think about it and go have another cigarette. Right? So it's not going to be effective if it's inducing a very high level of threat. So a moderate level tends to be most effective. Another really key factor, and this was talked a bit about in the podcast you listened to for this week, is opportunities for action. And so inducing threat works to get behavior change if there's clear opportunities to act on that threat to alleviate it, right? So if you threaten people with, the concerns about a sexually transmitted disease, but then immediately provide them an opportunity for testing, they're less likely to defend against that than with the smoking example, right? It's much harder to create the opportunity to quit smoking. It's a lot harder to do that. And so there's not a clear thing they can do to just get rid of that threat. They'd have to maintain that over time. And that relates to the next point about the timing of the required behavior. It's much easier to threat-induce people to do something one time than to continue to do it over time, right? So it works well for getting flu vaccines. You just need to go once a year. You can threaten people thinking about getting the flu and getting sick, and that might induce them to go get that flu shot because you just have to do it once. But again, threatening people into flossing, exercising, quitting smoking tends to be less effective because eventually that threat dissipates, right? We don't stay in a highly fearful state for a long time, so that motivational effect is going to go away pretty quickly. And so, while one day I might be really worried about, my teeth are starting to deteriorate a little bit, I'm getting older, I have bad genetics for my teeth, but that doesn't, so one night I'll see that and freak out and floss a bunch, but then the next day, right, I have to let that fear pass, and so now it's not motivating anymore. We adapt to that, and so the behaviors stop happening when we're less afraid. You can see this very clearly, particularly in the U.S. now with COVID, right? So initially, many people were very fearful about that, and there was a major threat, and people did more social distancing. But as people adapted to that threat, even though the threat didn't go away, the threat is just as much or more present now. People got adapted to that, and they stopped changing their behavior because they stopped being in that scared state perpetually. Again, this is on average, not everybody. People who continue to be feeling more threatened, understandably so, are doing a better job of social distancing. But people adapt to threats, and so that loses its motivational power over time. So again, these fear appeals tend to be most effective for things that you just need to do once to take care of that threat. Personality match matters as well. So some people are more susceptible to threatening messages than others, and so we will talk a bit about that in terms of gain and loss frame. But also just we know that neurotic individuals are more susceptible to these threatening messages. They're more interested in avoiding these negative outcomes and process that information more. So we showed that. Here's an example of a study that looked at fear appeals, and so what they did in this study was they presented people with two health messages about getting a tetanus shot, and the first was a very fact-based case history, right? This is just a very cognitive message. This is based on information. It's educational. And the second one was a fear-based message. It was very vivid, scary case history of tetanus. It told somebody's story of everything terrible that happened to them when they got this, and so this is the fear-based message. So essentially, they're comparing an educational and a fear-based message in this study. And what they found is that, then they crossed this, right, these two different conditions of these two different health messages, and they crossed that with some participants got instructions for where to go and how to get a tetanus shot, and the other people didn't. And so here we're looking at these opportunities for action, right? So some people got an opportunity for action and some people didn't. So this is a 2x2 study where they crossed the message, the type of message you got, educational versus fear, with information or no information on how to act. And so what they find is that the scarier messages are more persuasive, but only if participants had a clear plan on how to act on that. If there was no clear plan provided, both of the messages were equally persuasive. So again, the fear ones only seem to be persuasive if they're paired with something you can do about that fear. Otherwise, we just engage in other mechanisms to try not to be afraid. We think about other things, we seek out distractions, we say that's not going to really happen to us, and so again, as long as you have a pathway to move forward on, then we can act on that, but otherwise we will engage in processes to defend against that threat. So there's multiple different ways you could possibly respond to health-threatening information, right? You might respond to it by changing your behavior. You might decide, okay, now that I know how bad smoking is for me, I'll stop. You could deny or defend against that health information. You could say, yeah, that's true, but it's really not going to apply to me, or it wouldn't be that bad, or I've got a lot of years left. And so that's another way you might deal with that threat. A third one that I'm going to talk about here is you might reduce that threat by affirming yourself in a different domain. And so this will make more sense once I talk about this study, but just briefly what this means is that you can sort of shore up your sense of self in another area that's important to you, right? So you might be now feeling bad about your health and feeling vulnerable. They've pointed out to me, I'm 33 now and I don't exercise, and that's, not going to be good for my long-term heart health. And so that's threatening. I don't like to think about that. And so one way I could reduce that threat is to say, yeah, that's true, but I'm doing really well in other parts of my life. I have a great relationship, or I love my job. And interestingly, that allows people to then be more open to processing that threat in the other area of their life. And so I want to show a study that looks at that. So the way we could think about self-affirmation, or the affirmation piece, or the shoring up of the self in this, is we could think about, we have a sense of self, right? We have an image of ourself hopefully as a competent, worthy, and adaptive person. Most people have this image, unless we're suffering from mental health issues. Most people, we do think of ourselves as pretty competent, adaptive people, right? And so in this case, you're getting this threatening health information, and this threatens this aspect of yourself. There's many aspects to ourself. We have our health, we have our family, we have our religion potentially, we have our school sense of self, our achievement in academic domains, we have our friendships. But so in this case, we're getting threatening health information, and it's threatening that aspect of ourself, and therefore our overall aspect of self. But if we can shore up another area, like, for example, remind ourselves of what a great family we have, that can help us to feel less threatened overall. It doesn't change the threat to health, but it lets our overall self be less threatened, and then therefore more open to processing this otherwise threatening health information. And so what's key in this process of self-affirmation is you have to affirm in a domain that's different than the one being threatened. If you affirm in health, that would be like saying, yeah, I smoke, but I'm actually healthy otherwise, so it doesn't matter. And that doesn't lead people to be open to processing that threatening health information. It's really about, you need to affirm in some other aspect of yourself so that you can fully process that, yeah, this actually is negatively impacting my health, and I need to do something about that. So what a self-affirmation study often looks like is they'll bring participants into the lab, and they'll have them write down a list of 10 of their values, for example. And then they'll say, in the self-affirmation condition, you'll write about your top value. You'll spend 5 to 10 minutes writing about the thing that you value most. And so that gives you a chance to affirm in that domain, right? Most people tend to pick friends or family and write about that, and it makes people feel quite good. It reminds them of the social connections they have and that they're a good and valuable and loved person. In the other condition, in the non-self-affirmation condition, they ask you to pick something, they ask you to write about something that was on the top of someone else's list, but not yours. So you're just writing about a value, but it's not your value, so it doesn't really work to affirm yourself in that same way. This list here is just examples of some of the values that people come up with when making these lists. And so what they do in this study that we're going to talk about here, this one is related to AIDS education, and they did this type of self-affirmation intervention to see how that impacted people's responses to this otherwise threatening educational video about AIDS. They're calling it an educational video, but really it's a fear appeal. It's a video that shows a bunch of young people talking about their experience with AIDS and how terrible it has been, and so it's very threatening. It's got many sort of horrifying images and things like that. It's showing you all of the terrible things that could happen. And so what they do is half the participants do this self-affirmation first, so they affirm themselves in another domain, and then the other half does not do that. They write about some other value, so they're not affirmed, and then everybody watches this threatening video. And then what they looked at for their dependent variables were, what were your perceptions of personal risk for HIV? Are you accurate in your perception of risk, or are you minimizing that risk and saying, yeah, that's a thing, but it's not going to happen to me? So we're looking for people to have accurate perception, because that would mean that they're not in denial. They're really processing this health information and saying, yeah, I'm at risk for this. And then they looked at, as a measure of their behavioral intentions to engage in safe sex, they looked at how many condoms they purchased and how many brochures they took. So this was all done at a little intervention in event at a university campus, and so they could actually they had condoms for sale there, and they measured how many people purchased at that as one of the dependent variables. And so what they found here is that what we're seeing in this graph is the perceptions of risk for HIV. And so people in the affirmation condition perceive themselves at higher risk for HIV than in the no affirmation condition. And this is good because this is an accurate perception of risk. University students are at risk for contracting HIV, and this assessment is much closer to the actual risk than the no affirmation. So what's happening here is in the no affirmation condition, they're defending against this threatening information and saying, yeah, this is not really going to happen to me. They're minimizing their risk, even though there actually is some level of risk. So the affirmation is more correct in their risk assessment. Then we also see that a greater percentage of people in the affirmation condition purchased condoms than in the no affirmation condition. And so this is suggesting that presumably they're going to use these condoms, that they have more intentions to engage in safe sex. So they're perceiving themselves at higher risk, and then they're engaging in a behavior, buying condoms, that will help them to mitigate this risk. And so again, what this study is showing is that through affirmation, people are more willing to process the negative health information, have an accurate perception of their risk, and then behave accordingly. Then let me see what I'm talking about here. Oh yeah, so we've gone through these key factors. We talked about level of threat. We talked about opportunities for action. We talked about the timing of the behavior itself. And then I want to talk a little bit more about personality match here. And so this can we can try to match people's personality by the way that we frame the message, or the way that the message is phrased. And so a loss-framed message focuses on the bad things that can happen if you don't do a behavior, for example. So, for example, a disadvantage of failing to get regular mammograms is that you won't find tumors early, which will leave you with fewer treatment options. Or you could say if you don't floss, you're going to get heart disease and your teeth will fall out. So bad things will happen if you don't do it. You could also think of a gain frame, where you think of good things that can happen if you do a behavior. So, for example, an advantage of getting regular mammograms is that you will find tumors early, which will increase treatment options. Or with the flossing example, if you floss, you'll have healthier teeth and gums and you'll look great. You'll have a dazzling smile, right? That's really focused on the positives that can happen. And it turns out that these messages are more or less appealing depending on the type of person who is receiving them. And so what we find that there's a congruency effect. And so health messages that are framed in a way that is concordant or consistent with an individual's own dispositional motivations will be most effective in leading to behavior change. So some people are more approach-oriented. They like to seek out the best in life. They're looking to maximize their positive outcomes. These are people who go into a class saying, I'm going to get an A. And there's also avoidance-oriented people, and those are those of us, like myself, who are trying to avoid bad things happening. We're trying not to fail. We're trying not to die. That's our approach to things. And both can be equally successful in their endeavors, right? Approach-oriented people don't necessarily do better in school than avoidance-oriented people, but it's a way of, it's a different way of motivating oneself and orienting to the world. Are you trying to approach good things or avoid bad things? And so for people who are approach-oriented, they're much more persuaded to change their behavior by gain frame messages, right? That appeals to their orientation. They like to seek out good things, and gain frame messages tell them about how behavior will lead to good things. Avoidance-oriented people are motivated by avoiding bad outcomes, and so they're much more motivated by these loss frame messages that tell them how to avoid bad outcomes. This is a study that looks at that. You can, it's amazing to see how much the rigorous nature of studies has changed over the years. This is only this is less than 20 years old, this study, and they only had 63 participants in it in multiple conditions. But this one has been replicated in many different contexts. It's just this is a great one to illustrate this point. But what they do in this study is they measured people's approach and avoidance orientations, and then they had those individuals read either gain or loss framed messages about flossing. And then a week later, they measured their flossing behavior. So they had given everybody individual flossers to take home. And then any that they didn't use during that week, they were asked to send back and paid a very small amount of money to do that. And that's how they assessed how often they flossed. So basically how many of those they actually used. And so what they found, I'm getting ahead of myself. So this is just an example of what a loss frame message looked like. So they made these fake articles, right? This one says, the loss frame says floss now or forever hold your breath. Dentists recommend flossing as essential for preventing halitosis and gum disease. Right? It's got phrases like avoid the kiss of death, right? It's very threatening and loss framed. Whereas the gain framed one says sweet breath, healthy gums, only a floss away. Dentists recommend flossing as essential for promoting healthy teeth and great breath. And so this is going to be much more appealing to those gain framed people to those approach oriented people. And indeed, that's what they found. So that's what we're looking at in this graph. This is how many flosses they used of the 7 over the week. So first of all, you can see nobody flossed every day. So even these health messages, even when they are somewhat effective, people still didn't reach this 7 days. But what we can see is that people who read the loss-framed article, this was more effective for those who had an avoidance motivation orientation than for those who had an approach motivation. Right? So the loss-framed article worked best for avoidance motivation, and the gain-framed article worked best for approach-motivated people. We could say this same thing in a slightly different way and say that for the avoidance-motivated people, both of the blue bars, the loss-framed message was much more effective. And the opposite occurred, though not quite to the same extent. For the approach-motivated people, they were more persuaded by the gain-framed article and less persuaded by the loss-framed article. So this, is showing the congruency effect between the message and the person's own motivational orientation. So that's it for new content today. Thank you so much. And so if you have questions, you're welcome to put those directly in this videos or all of these videos, or you can comment them on the discussion board. You can put them in the weekly survey, and I'll answer those during the live hour that comes up next week. Or you are also welcome to bring those questions to that session live. So thank you so much, and I'll see you next week.